Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really knotty problem, trying to understand what drives Vladimir Putin,
hmm
especially when we look back at his actions around the annexation of Crimea in 2014. It's just one of those topics where, clear facts seem buried under layers of interpretation and, let's be honest, quite a bit of deliberate spin.
Absolutely. Yeah, trying to get a definitive picture of Putin's motivations. It's like piecing together a puzzle, but, some pieces are missing and the picture on the box keeps changing.
Right.
We really have to be aware that so much of what we hear is either speculation or very carefully constructed narratives. And, substantive biographies, especially from Russian sources, they're surprisingly thin on the ground.
Exactly. So instead of trying to create a sort of straight chronological story, which is, well, difficult given that landscape, we're going to approach it a bit differently. We'll focus more on the formative experiences, the circumstances that seem to have kind of shaped his worldview. Think of it as looking for the consistent patterns, the underlying logic, especially when we look at a huge event like Crimea.
That makes sense. The goal really is to try and cut through some of that noise, identify those recurring themes, maybe the hidden drivers, the core motivations that could shed light on why he makes the decisions he does. And Crimea, yeah, it offers a particularly revealing window into that.
Okay, so let's zero in on Crimea, specifically March 2014. It all happened incredibly fast. Putin gives this really powerful speech. There's the signing of the reunification documents, and he frames the whole thing as this huge historic moment for Russia.
And his justification wasn't simple. It was deeply rooted in his particular view of Russian history. He argued Crimea had always been, quote, an inseparable part of Russia.
Tracing it way back.
Way back, yeah, back to the adoption of Orthodox Christianity, the Russian Empire. It's a long view.
And he also brought up these long simmering grievances from the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right.
And this feeling, this palpable sense that the Russian state was just left weak, unable to protect its own interests during that chaotic time.
Yeah, and a really key part of his argument was this idea of a profound historical injustice. He pointed fingers directly at the Bolsheviks and then later Khrushchev in 1954 for transferring Crimea to Ukraine. He saw these as fundamental mistakes.
Mistakes needing correction.
Needing correction, exactly. He even used this quite stark analogy comparing Russian-speaking Crimeans inside Ukraine after '91 to a sack of potatoes, basically saying they were just moved around, without any thought for their identity or history.
Which feeds directly into this broader narrative. He often promotes this idea as a single Russian nation, historically united, but then artificially divided by political borders. But of course, this didn't happen in a vacuum. There was major political turmoil happening in Ukraine right before all this.
Oh, absolutely. You have to remember, starting late 2013, these massive protests kicked off in Ukraine. They were initially sparked by President Yanukovych pulling back from an EU association agreement.
Right, the Maidan protests.
Exactly. But they quickly grew into much broader anti-government protests. Things escalated.
And by February 2014, it had gotten really violent. Clashes between protesters and police. People were killed. It was tragic. And this ultimately led to Yanukovych fleeing the country and a new interim government forming very quickly.
And almost immediately after Yanukovych left, these unidentified armed men, the so-called Little Green Men, started seizing key buildings and infrastructure across Crimea. Then, very fast, early March, the Crimean parliament votes for a snap referendum. Independence and joining Russia were on the table.
And that referendum, March 16th, it produced these, overwhelming figures, according to the official Russian reports anyway. 97% voting to join Russia.
With a reported turnout of over 82%. And Putin seized on those results. That was his core justification.
He framed it as self-determination.
Right. The Crimean people exercising their right to choose to rejoin what he called the Russian world and historical Russia.
But internationally, the reaction was, very different. It was seen as a huge blow to European security, a violation of international law. Russia was suddenly being called a revisionist power. Can you unpack that term, revisionist power, in this context? What order were they revising?
Sure. So in international relations, a revisionist power is basically a state that wants to change the existing international system, the rules, the borders, the norms. The post-Cold War order in Europe was largely built on respecting existing borders. Russia annexing Crimea flew directly in the face of that fundamental principle, so they were seen as trying to forcibly revise that accepted order.
Okay, that clarifies it. It was just such a rapid pivot, wasn't it? One minute Russia seems like it might mediate the crisis in Ukraine, the next it's annexing territory.
Extremely rapid. Which naturally sparked those big questions everywhere. Why? Why did Putin do this? What's the end game here? What does he actually want? People were scrambling to figure out his motivations.
And a whole range of interpretations started popping up. Some said, well, this is just Putin the authoritarian consolidating power, maybe using nationalism to boost his ratings back home.
Others saw it as something bigger, maybe the emergence of a sort of overt imperial ambition, a desire to maybe not rebuild the USSR completely, but definitely reassert Russian dominance in its neighborhood.
Which led people to wonder, was this always the plan? Did we just miss the signs?
Exactly. Or maybe Putin himself had changed somehow. Was this a new Putin acting differently than the seemingly more pragmatic leader we thought we knew?
And this is where that idea of pattern breaks you mentioned earlier comes in, isn't it?
Precisely. If Crimea really was a major break from his past behavior, it forces us to question our basic assumptions about him. These moments, these deviations, they can be really useful clues. They might help us uncover those deeper, more consistent aspects of his thinking, his core values, his hidden drivers. It shifts the focus from just what happened to why.
It's really striking when you think about how much of the story around Putin is shaped by what we don't know, or rather, the lack of certain kinds of information. You mentioned the absence of substantial Russian biographies.
Yes, it's quite remarkable, especially over the last decade and a half. You just don't see the kind of independent insider accounts, memoirs, or critical biographies coming out of Russia about Putin that you might expect, or that you see in the West about Western leaders.
No tells.
Not really. In fact, the flow of genuinely independent information seems to have tightened over time. Instead, what you get are these stories, often attributed to vague sources, someone close to the Kremlin.
And you see the same old stories getting recycled too, presented as new insights sometimes.
Which makes understanding him incredibly difficult. You're navigating this information space where he, or at least his administration, has a huge amount of control over the narrative. They shape the facts, they influence the interpretation.
You have to be skeptical.
You have to be. Treat every piece of information carefully. Try to trace it back. And maybe the most important question to ask is, why is this particular story being circulated now? What's the purpose behind it?
Because it seems clear his team is skilled at both stopping information getting out and putting out what some call pseudo-information, stuff that looks credible but is designed to mislead. It creates this weird situation, doesn't it? We live in this age of information overload, social media everywhere, yet we can still be surprisingly ignorant about basic facts concerning one of the world's most powerful figures.
It's a definite paradox, and one narrative that keeps popping up, this idea of Putin having a diminished sense of danger, is a fascinating case study in itself.
Right, I've seen that mentioned in recent analyses, linking it to his risk-taking.
Exactly. But the interesting thing is the primary source for that claim seems to be Putin's own book from way back in 2000, От Prvého лица, First Person. Ah, okay. I remember reading about that. In the book, he talks about his KGB Academy assessment, right? And how they noted this lowered sense of danger as a negative trait.
That's the one. He acknowledges it was seen as a serious negative in that context. But here's the thing. That book was essentially a campaign biography.
Right, published just as he was running for president.
Precisely. Carefully put together by his team to craft a specific image for the Russian public.
Right.
Every story, every detail in there was likely chosen for a political reason. So the fact that this diminished sense of danger idea originates there should make us pause and think about its purpose.
And the way the book ends is kind of strange, too, relating to this. The interviewers say he seems predictable, and he pushes back with that story about nearly crashing his car trying to grab hay from a truck.
Yes, with his martial arts coach in the car who just says, you take risks.
And Putin's explanation is just odd. Something like, I guess I thought the hay smelled good. Doesn't really make sense. It doesn't. It leaves you scratching your head. And maybe that's the point. It adds to this aura of unpredictability, maybe even recklessness. Even within the book, there are slightly different versions of when this trait was noticed. KGB Academy, university friends.
It's a bit fuzzy.
So the intended effect might just be that ambiguity, to make people think he's capable of taking big risks, But maybe he's also got it all calculated. Keeps people guessing.
That seems very likely. It cultivates an image. Keep opponents off balance. Make them uncertain about how you'll react.
It sounds a bit like Nixon's madman theory, trying to seem irrational to gain leverage.
There are parallels, yes. But with Putin, it might be even more complex. Not just projecting an image, but also watching how that image, how that information spreads and gets interpreted. It's like he's playing the strategic game of telephone.
Focusing on perceptions.
Focusing on how things are perceived, maybe more than the objective reality itself, using that to gain a tactical advantage. So the big takeaway there is that for Putin, perception might actually be reality, or at least more important than reality. He uses others, analysts, other leaders, the public as players in his game, watching their reactions to understand them better, while revealing very little about himself. He's constantly shifting, adopting different personas.
The ultimate political performance artist, perhaps? And that ties into the very deliberate, sometimes almost theatrical way his public image has been managed by his PR team over the years.
Right, all those different staged photos and videos.
Exactly. One minute he's the rugged hunter, the next he's saving tigers, then he's diving for ancient amphorae, riding with bikers, even singing in a nightclub.
It's quite a contrast to most world leaders who tend to have a much more consistent public image, right? Certain suit, a certain tie.
Very different. Someone compared it to that old British children's TV character, Mr. Ben, who'd try on a costume and magically enter that world. Putin seems to do something similar, facilitated by his press team.
And yeah, okay, some of those episodes look pretty staged, maybe even a bit silly to outsiders. The amphorae incident comes to mind.
They definitely caused some amusement, yes, and led some to see him as maybe a bit shallow or lacking substance. But these Mr. Putin episodes, as some call them, they seem to have a very specific, targeted aim.
They're not just random stunts.
Not at all. They seem carefully designed to connect with specific groups within Russia, informed by polling data, trying to build a direct personal link. Remember, his press secretary, Peskov, basically admitted as much after the amphorae dive. He said it was about drawing attention.
And Putin himself has said something like, his skill is being seen as what the Russian people need him to be. The ultimate Russian action man.
But it goes deeper than just trying to look relatable to win votes, like a Western politician might. It seems to be also about showing respect to different parts of Russian society, validating their place.
Like the bikers or the conservationists.
Exactly. Making them feel seen, feel part of the larger Russian whole, creating a sense of commonality, of unity.
It makes me think, actually, of how leaders in more traditional societies sometimes operate. Like Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan. The emphasis on shura, on consensus building, where showing respect and listening to different tribes or groups was crucial.
That's a really interesting comparison. It's about demonstrating that you hear different voices. Putin himself has claimed he personally wants to draw attention to people, places, issues that might otherwise be neglected. And, well, whatever the motivation, these acts seem to have worked in maintaining his consistently high popularity ratings inside Russia.
So it serves a double purpose. Shores up domestic support, and at the same time, it confuses outside analysts trying to figure out who the real Putin is.
He even seemed to hint at this himself once, referencing that famous Tuchev poem about Russia, how you can't understand it with reason, only believe in it, almost suggesting his own persona is similarly enigmatic.
Which brings us back to this core idea you're exploring, the concept of the real Mr. Putins. The argument being that to really get a handle on him, we need to look past the performances.
Exactly. Look past the stagecraft and identify the multiple, probably more stable underlying identities that actually shape his thinking and actions.
And the framework suggests there are 6 key ones that were particularly important in the 2000s. The statist, the history man, the survivalist, the outsider, the free marketeer, and the case officer.
That's the proposal. The analysis essentially divides into 2 parts. Part 1 digs into those 6 identities, where they came from in Russian history, culture, politics, how they evolved in Putin up to around 2012.
Okay.
Part 2 then looks at how that combination of identities helps explain his responses to later challenges, like the protests in 2011-12, or, crucially, the Ukraine crisis starting in 2014.
And those first 3, statist, history man, survivalist, they're presented as being maybe more common, more representative of a whole generation of Russians shaped by the Soviet Union and then the 1990s.
Sort of. They form the bedrock, you could say. They explain his fundamental views on the Russian state, its role, its history, its need to survive and be strong. These really colored his first couple of presidential terms.
And the 1990s are absolutely central to understanding those identities, aren't they? The economic collapse, the political chaos, the sense of lost status.
Hugely important. That period of perceived weakness and humiliation is a constant reference point for Putin. Think about his Millennium Message back in 1999, or his 2012 election campaign, always contrasting his leadership with the supposed chaos of the 1990s under Yeltsin. It's a core part of his narrative.
So if those first three explain the goals, the vision for Russia, then the next three, outsider, free marketeer, case officer, are more about the how, the methods he uses.
That's the idea. These are seen as more personal, shaped by his specific background, growing up in Leningrad, his KGB training and experience, his time working in the St. Petersburg mayor's office in the rough and tumble early 90s. They relate more to his operational style, his tactics.
So putting it all together, the goal isn't a simple biography, but more like a contextual portrait, trying to map out his mental landscape, his worldview, based on all these different strands of experience.
Exactly. Soviet upbringing, Russian history, law school, the KGB years, St. Petersburg, Moscow politics, the presidency itself, all these contexts feed into it.
And it's important to stress, these identities aren't like separate boxes he switches between, right? They overlap, they blend together.
Absolutely. They're parallel, interconnected, and look, we can't know everything. We don't know the specifics of his KGB work. We can't read his thoughts from the 1990s.
Of course.
But we can analyze the context he was in. We can look at the KGB during his time, the careers of people like Andropov or Bobkov. We can look at the political debates and ideas swirling around in the 1990s that clearly influenced him and those around him. His own speeches and writings from 1999 onwards show him adopting language and concepts from that period.
So it's about finding what seems most credible within that known context to build up this picture of his different identities.
Precisely. Trying to understand the forces that shaped him. And, his time back in St. Petersburg in the 90s as Anatoly Sobchak's sort of fixer.
Right, dealing with the emerging, often corrupt business world, enforcing informal rules.
That seems to have been incredibly formative. Learning how power really worked on the ground outside the formal structures. That experience undoubtedly helped pave his way to Moscow.
So wrapping this up, it's clear that getting a real understanding of Vladimir Putin is, it's an ongoing and incredibly complex task. We've touched on the deliberate shaping of information, the staged public shows, and this really interesting idea of looking for deeper, more consistent identities beneath the surface to explain his actions, especially concerning something as significant as Crimea.
Which really leaves us with a crucial question, something for you, the listener, to think about. What does it mean for international relations when a major leader seems to value perception over reality and actively cultivates an image of unpredictability? How does that change the way power works, the way states interact? And stepping back, what hidden real identities might be shaping the actions of any world leader beyond the image they project? What are the subtle games of narrative and perception being played out on the world stage every day?